Welcome to The Explainer. So glad you're here with us today. We're going to dive right into an incredibly complex, fast-moving geopolitical earthquake. We are looking at the unprecedented multi-front crisis currently facing Iran. We're going to unpack the latest data, internal reports, and some wild diplomatic movements to see exactly how a nation that has historically prided itself on total self-reliance is suddenly facing these immense compounding pressures. Let's just get right into it and see how these forces are all stacking up.
To really grasp the sheer gravity of this situation right out of the gate, check out this recent quote from Donald Trump. Iran has informed us that they are in a state of collapse. A state of collapse. Now, based on internal reports, that phrase isn't just hyperbole. It refers directly to the crippling economic reality caused by a massive US naval blockade. The stakes right now are absolutely existential, and honestly, regime officials know it.
So, to get the full picture, we've got to look at this crisis as a kind of domino effect. First, we'll look at the Gulf naval blockade. Second, the resulting domestic panic and internet blackouts. Third, the ticking oil clock. Fourth, the diplomatic scramble. And finally, the geopolitical nuclear roadblock.
All right, starting with part one, the Gulf naval blockade. This is the catalyst for the whole situation.
This blockade officially kicked off on April 13th, and the numbers paint a pretty clear picture of how this chokehold works. It's a devastating double whammy for the Iranian economy. On one side, zero exports are going out. Satellite data literally shows Iranian ports getting more and more crowded because their oil tankers simply cannot leave. But on the flip side, zero imports are coming in. And since Iran heavily depends on imports to feed its people, halting those food shipments is a massive blow. They're essentially trapped from both directions, which is sending absolute shockwaves through their local supply chains.
So, you might be wondering, how long can they actually survive this? Well, the most fascinating part of these internal reports is that Iran's own Supreme National Security Council held an urgent meeting, and their internal estimates suggest the economy can only withstand 6 to 8 weeks of this US naval blockade. 6 to 8 weeks. And remember, that timeline is coming straight from Iranian officials, so actually, scratch that. It's safe to say this is likely their absolute best case, most optimistic scenario.
Which brings us to part two, domestic panic and internet blackouts. All this economic pressure is translating directly into deep panic among regime security agencies. They are absolutely terrified of renewed protests, similar to the ones that nearly toppled them back in January. So, to stop that from happening, the regime has taken some incredibly drastic measures. Over 60 days, that is how long a near-total internet blackout has been in effect across Iran. We're talking about 99.9% of the country, roughly 90 million people, completely cut off from the rest of the world. The regime is so scared of its own citizens organizing that they've literally plunged the entire nation into digital darkness.
But, as you can imagine, plunging your country offline comes with a staggering domestic cost. 2 million. That's the estimated number of private sector jobs wiped out because of this shutdown. Let me put that into perspective. Roughly 20% of Iran's entire online workforce has been rendered completely unemployed by their own government's actions. It's a total vicious cycle, right? They shut down the internet to stop protests over the economy, but the shutdown itself is destroying millions of livelihoods, which is only fueling even more unrest.
Moving on to part three, the ticking oil clock. It's a full-blown logistical nightmare.
This brings us to a huge problem regarding Iran's most valuable asset, oil. Looking at the data from Kepler, they're a major global research firm, we can see a massive bottleneck. Since the tankers can't export the oil, Iran is forced to just store it all. But Kepler estimates that Iran's unused oil storage is going to hit absolute maximum capacity in a minimum of 12 days and an optimistic maximum of 22 days. Once those storage tanks are full, they physically have nowhere else to put the oil they're producing. The clock is quite literally ticking.
Now, just to clarify exactly how tight this net really is, let's look at the mechanics. The blockade strictly targets ships entering or leaving Iranian ports. A crucial detail to understand here is that ships can load up in Iran and cross the Strait of Hormuz just fine, but the actual blockade line is drawn further out, bordering the Arabian Sea. So once they hit the Gulf of Oman, boom, they're stuck. According to researchers tracking all of this, there have been exactly 0 tankers observed successfully evading this blockade. 0.
All right, part 4, diplomatic scramble and the Russia contact.
With their ports completely blocked and oil storage filling up fast, Iran is frantically making moves to survive. And this sequence maps out their desperation perfectly. Step 1. Iran tries to send a revised peace proposal to the US, basically asking them, hey, can you please lift the blockade? Step 2. The US flatly rejects it, completely refusing to toss them a lifeline. Step 3.
With the US door slammed in their face, the Iranian foreign minister immediately hops on a plane and flies straight to St. Petersburg to ask Vladimir Putin for help.
And that trip resulted in a 2-hour closed-door meeting in Russia, notably involving the head of the Russian security services. What's so fascinating to see here is the transactional role reversal. Think about it. Early in the Ukraine war, Iran was the one providing Russia with resources, right? Drones, engineers. But now, with Russia heavily bogged down in its own operations, Iran is the one showing up at the doorstep, desperately trying to cash in favors and begging for intervention behind closed doors. Finally, let's look at part 5, the geopolitical nuclear roadblock and the US rejection.
To really understand why the US just flat out rejected Iran's proposal to lift the blockade, we need to look at the assessment from US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Analyzing the regime as the source of the problem, he said, the country is run by radical Shia clerics. They're deeply fractured internally. So, Rubio's analysis points out that while some officials might actually want to run a functioning economy, others are motivated entirely by radical theology, and that deep clash is creating massive internal instability. And that internal fracturing leads to this absolutely wild, massive question. Is the new supreme leader even alive and in control? Based on ongoing intelligence analysis, Secretary Rubio explicitly raised doubts about whether the new leader, Mosjaba, has the credibility, the clerical credentials, or even the basic autonomy to make any decisions. There's a very real possibility that someone else is secretly running the show in his stead.
Right now, we're seeing this severe ambiguity completely paralyzing Iran's leadership structure, and the clues we're getting are deeply conflicting. So, on one hand, at a recent Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps event, the new supreme leader's picture was displayed on a mural, alongside people who are confirmed dead. Suspicious, right? But then, on the other hand, during those meetings in Russia, Vladimir Putin claimed to have received a written message from him. A written message, not a phone call, not a video. The absolute highest level of Iranian leadership is completely shrouded in mystery at the exact moment the country desperately needs direction.
So, knowing all that, why exactly did the US walk away from the negotiating table? Well, here's Marco Rubio's intelligence assessment in a nutshell. Iran's proposal basically said, we'll open the Strait of Hormuz if you lift the blockade, but they wanted to delay any nuclear talks. The US rejected this because, well, the nuclear issue is the entire core of the conflict. According to Rubio, Iran is fundamentally revolutionary. They are actively seeking regional domination through groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. He argues that Iran uses the Strait of Hormuz as what he calls an economic nuclear weapon, essentially holding 20 to 25% of the world's energy hostage.
And that brings us to our final takeaway for this explainer. The data we've looked at shows a regime that is entirely willing to sacrifice its own economy, shut down the internet for 90 million of its own people, and restrict international shipping, all just to ensure its own survival. So the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves as we wrap up is this: if the Iranian regime acts this aggressively and destructively just to survive right now, what happens to the region, and honestly the world, if they actually acquire a nuclear weapon? It's a deeply sobering thought, and it's exactly why this blockade continues to hold strong today. Thank you so much for joining me to break this all down. I really hope this helped clear up some of the incredible complexities of this ongoing crisis.